And welcome back to Mindset Monday. I'm Gene Zanetti, your coast-to-coast mindset coach from Winning Mindset. Tonight we're going to be talking about the mindset red flags. So after working with tens and thousands of athletes for the past 11 years of all sports, we found that athletes tend to struggle with the same kind of difficulties. Okay, in other words, it's not scattered. It's not all across the board. Athletes tend to make the same kind of mistakes mentally. And it's kind of like, if you think about it, think about an optical illusion. Maybe you had books when you were a kid of optical illusions, right? The interesting thing about an optical illusion is it's not that our brains, from person to person, our brains don't make all different mistakes. Our brains make predictable mistakes. That's why an optical illusion, each person is going to be fooled the same way when they look at the same thing. Okay, so our brains are wired in such a way that we make predictable mistakes when we look at things, optical illusions. Well, it's the same thing with our mental mistakes, with different areas in sports that we tend to get tripped up with. Okay, so we've identified these different areas. We made it very concrete, very simple for everyone to understand. There's a little bit of variation in sports, but it's only with the terminology. Only the terminology changes a little bit because the mindset flags really remain stable no matter what sport we're talking about. So let's go through some of these, and these are in no particular order. And I'm sure there are more, but let's go through a few of them. So first, competing too cautious, hesitating, playing too conservative. So in other words, we normally in practice maybe we have that killer instinct. We have that aggressiveness. We try different techniques and different skills. We have the tools and we use it in practice, but in competitions, we tend to be too cautious, too conservative, too hesitant, right? We balk at the last second in a competition, right? So a lot of times that's what happens, and usually it's because in competitions, we tend to make them into a big deal. Now, of course, we're training to perform well in competitions, but this is the way you want to look at it. We tell all of our athletes this. Everything's important, but nothing's special. You have to treat every single competition as important. You have to treat every single practice as important, but you can't make it special. The moment you make a competition special, you tend to do worse. I mean, that's just how it is. There are like 1 in 30 athletes, they can make a competition special and they do better, but that's very rare. Okay, most people, most of the time, you treat everything the same. That's what brings about consistency. All top athletes talk about consistency, right? Well, you can't talk about having a consistent performance if we don't first talk about having consistent thoughts, consistent words, and consistent emotions. Okay, so treating everything the same. 2 great examples I always give of this. Bruce Springsteen. He broke his own record in New Jersey for the longest concert. And they asked him, Bruce, how do you bring so much energy every time you play? And he said, well, I tell myself 2 things. Number 1, this is the most important concert of my life, so he's making it important. And 2, it's only rock and roll. So he's making it important, but he's not making it special. Okay, and the other person that I use is the surgeon who operated on Bill Clinton. They interviewed after, and they said, well, how were you able to focus knowing you were operating on a former president? And he said, I just treated him like he was any other patient. So it was important, but it wasn't special. 9 out of 10 times, if you make a competition special, you're gonna do worse. And it's not just competing in sports, it's taking a test, right? Taking the SATs or ACTs. As a school psychologist, I had many parents and many teachers say, this kid's not a good test taker. This kid doesn't do well on standardized tests. And I used to think, is it really that the kid is not a good test taker? Maybe, but in all probability, the kid's making the SATs and the ACTs special. He's making it into a big deal. So they wind up doing worse. We had one of our athletes really wants to get into Brown, does very well in the practice SATs, but he chokes during the real SATs. Well, what's going on there? He's making the real SATs special. And sure enough, when I spoke with him one-on-one, he admitted to me that while he's taking the real SATs, he's thinking about getting into Brown. When he takes the practice SATs, he doesn't think about getting into Brown. So you see what's going on there? It's what we're focusing on in those moments. So we want to make sure everything's important. We don't make anything special. That goes for a job interview when you tell yourself, I have to get this job, I need it, I must have it. That's when we tend to choke. Treat it like anything else. That's why you always practice the way you want to compete. If every practice is important, if every competition is important, no matter how good or bad your opponent is, you're more likely to perform well when it counts, right? So if you look at the top athletes, what are they normally saying after a championship? I'm just being me. I'm just doing what I always do. It's another day in the office. So everything's important, but nothing special. So when we see athletes, that red flag, being too cautious, too conservative, or too hesitant, that's what's usually happening there. They're making it special. Going along with that line of red flags, I kind of weaved another one in there. That's being a practice room competitor, right? In the sport of wrestling that I did, it was a practice room wrestler. We hear that all the time. Or a baseball player who plays better in the cages or in the pregame. They hit better in the cages or in the pregame than in the actual game, right? Or a golf player who's great on the range but can't bring it to the tee. It really doesn't matter what sport you're in. It's the same exact thing. You do well in practice, you don't do as well in competition. It's pretty predictable. We see it in a lot of people, and a lot of times we just don't take as many chances as we should. So being aware of that, there's a way to fix that. Also, poor body language. We see that constantly. A lot of times you could just give the eyeball test. You could look at an athlete and you could see they're not ready. Their body language, they're hanging their head, their shoulders are slouched, their head's down. They're not moving with bounce in their step, with pop in their attacks and their movements. There's no hustle. You could see it sometimes, just the eyeball test. I've talked to baseball coaches about this, saying you could just look at a kid before an at-bat and you could see they're not ready. Or in volleyball, I've heard coaches say to me that they could see when the player throws the ball up in the air, they could see that they're looking in the audience, they're looking in the crowd, they're looking to their dad, or they could see them lose focus while they're about to serve. Be the same thing with tennis, right? So a lot of times our body language it looks like we don't want to be there. We don't have that fire. And by just at that eyeball test, you could see that's a red flag. And another thing that goes along with that is being careful not to change our personality the day of a competition or right before a competition. I've definitely seen this with a lot of athletes, with myself too. Back when I was competing, I used to think you have to be real mad and just basically be mad and real fired up to compete well. So I'm normally a guy that likes to talk, I like to laugh, I like to joke around with friends. And then before a competition, I would, right before those 20 minutes, I'd put on my hood before I would wrestle. I'd listen to real angry music. I'd have a mean look on my face. I wouldn't talk to anyone. And I would go out there and compete. And maybe I did well in a lot of those competitions, but not quite reaching my potential as I would do in practice. And I saw this with one of my roommates' friends, another college high-level wrestler. Same thing. He changed his personality a lot right before he would go out there and compete, and usually he would do a lot worse than he did in the practice room or in the off season. So what's going on there? If we're changing too many variables, we're making it special, like we said before, we're more likely to do worse. So same body language in practice as you want in competition, and vice versa. Keep your personality the same. If you're a person that normally likes to talk, laugh, and joke around, build that into your pre-competition routine. And we'll talk about that more in a later date. It's very important to have a pre-game routine, a pre-match routine. If you're a football player, a pre-play routine. If you're a tennis player, a pre-serve routine. A golfer, a pre-shot routine. You get the picture, right? You have to have routines right before you're about to compete, right before, in between plays. You got to be able to do it, because that's what's going to put you in the right mindset. Well, if you're a person who normally smiles a lot and laughs, you want to continue doing that before you compete. Now, of course, you're taking it serious, so it's got to be worked in. It's something that takes a lot of time. There's an art to it. It's a science, but it's also an art. It takes some time, it takes some practice, a little bit of trial and error, but you want to see what's the mentality, mentally, emotionally, and physically. What do you need to do to be competing at your very best? So making sure you have them, making sure you have that pre-game routine, that pre-match routine, so you know you're ready to go and you're not changing things up. Your personality should remain relatively the same. If you're not a big talker, if you're normally quiet, don't then all of a sudden start talking to people when you're warming up for a competition, because you're changing your personality and you don't want to do that. Okay, so be who you are, do what you do, and you build that into your pre-competition routine. Some other mindset red flags: being a slow starter. How many times do we see that? Usually the team, if you look at the statistics, most sports, the team that scores first, or the individual that scores first, is usually the one that wins. Now, of course, there's many exceptions to that rule. It does not always happen. But majority of the time, the team or the individual that scores first usually wins. And I can't tell you how many athletes, all sports, they've said, if I would have just been competing, they just came off the competition, and they said, man, if I just played, or if I just competed the way I did at the end of the competition in the beginning, right? So in other words, they were a slow starter, they didn't get going in the beginning, but if I would have just did as well in the beginning as I did at the end, I could have beat that team. or I could have beat that opponent. Well, you got to be ready. When you're going up against competition that's equal to you, even a little bit better, you could beat them. But you got to come out of the blocks hard. You got to come out swinging. There's no hesitating. So I know in my sport, wrestling, my coach back in college, Zeke Jones, he was also the Olympic coach. And one of the things he said, he analyzed video footage for the NCAAs, the World Championships, the Olympic Championships, and he found that most takedowns happen in the sport of wrestling in the first 15 seconds of a whistle start. So anytime there's a whistle, and you start back on your feet on neutral, usually within 15 seconds, most takedowns happen within 15 seconds of that whistle start. Okay, so what does that mean? When you get in your stance, you step on that line, you got to be ready, because points are usually coming in that short time in the beginning. So you got to be ready. You know that goes for any sport. You got to come out of the blocks swinging. You can't get yourself warmed up or eased into a competition. You got to step out onto the field ready. So that means your pre-competition routine, that means your warm-up, it has to simulate a real game competition or a real match. So example, the sport of wrestling, if you're on deck, there's one more, if you're in the hole, whatever you call it, wherever you're in the country, some call it on deck, some call it in the hole. Well, if you're the next one to compete, you should have hands on you, and you should get your hands on another person. So in other words, it feels like you're wrestling before you step onto the mat. Okay, I've seen a lot of athletes, when they warm up, maybe they jump rope, maybe they skip around a little bit, they do some moves on their own, they shadow drill, those kind of things. They never get hands on a person, and they never get hands put on them. And then when they get out in a competition, what usually happens? Low score, no one's taking chances, and they're easing their way into a match. You cannot ease your way into a match, an at-bat, a competition. You never want to feel your opponent out. You hear this in all sports. I was feeling my opponent out. No, you're not feeling anyone out. You're there to impose your will. Okay, I get it. Like, there is an element of feeling the person out, but that should not be the predominant focus. Your predominant focus should be imposing your will from the beginning of the competition till the end. Very little feeling the person out. You can make adjustments as you're going, but that should not be. You don't step into a competition thinking, well, let's see how they feel. That is a defensive, soft, wussy, square mindset. Okay, we want to be imposing our will. We want to be going on the aggressive. Again, intelligently aggressive. We're not saying do anything or just stupid, careless recklessness. That's not what we're talking about. Intelligently aggressive. Okay, so great example that I saw of this a couple of years ago. It was before a dual meet. It was Rutgers against Rider. It was two guys who were ranked in the country. They were both, one guy was a two-time state champ, another one was a state finalist. They were two very aggressive wrestlers. I remember I watched these kids grow up, so both of them, and I knew both of them were very aggressive. And I was watching them warm up. They were the last match of the night. It was like the marquee match of the night, and they were the last ones ready to come out. Okay, and I remember watching them warm up. One guy did some sprints, another guy did some shadow wrestling. Neither guy got hands on their opponent, on a practice partner, or had hands put on them. So it felt totally different than practice, because normally in practice, you drill, which means you practice with the partner, and then you go live. Well, in this competition, it didn't happen. Neither of them touched another human being for about an hour. I was watching them. And then when they stepped out there in the match, the first period is 3 minutes. No score. 0-0. There were no flurries. There were no major attempts. No one really went after it. And why? Because both guys were easing their way into the match, and all the action happened with 4 minutes left in the competition. Well, if they would have got started 3 minutes before then, there would have been more action. Either guy could have won. The match was decided by like 1 or 2 points. So in other words, if either guy came out of the block swinging, they would have increased their chances of winning. Now again, this really goes for any sport. It doesn't matter, right? So before you step out there, before you're at bat, right, you should be simulating what you're going to do. You should be timing the pitchers. You should be swinging the bat, doing things that simulate your sport, right? Sport-related drills, and you don't want to get sucked into the event. And that's a big reason why a lot of us choke. Like, if you're looking at a kicker in football, a lot of times what are the kickers doing? They're looking at the score, the crowd's going crazy. If I was a kicker, I don't even know how much I would watch the game. I wouldn't recommend a kicker watch the game because it's putting pressure on them. What does that have to do with kicking the ball through the uprights, right? All you really need to know is you need to know the wind, right? You need to know where the ball is, which hash it's on, and kick the ball. Doesn't matter the score. Do what you normally do. So, if that might seem a little bit strange or odd at first, it's because maybe you're not used to thinking that way. But when you're too caught up in the game and what's going on, it tends to affect us mentally. It's a similar thing if you notice sports like gymnastics you watch in the Olympics, or figure skating, and a lot of times you see the people that are about to come up, the athletes that are about to compete, they're watching the other athletes compete. And a lot of times I tell our athletes, I don't like to do that, because what does their performance have to do with you? Really nothing, right? So if your opponent does well, if your opponent scores a 9.8 on the floor routine in gymnastics, what does that have to do with you, right? You got to focus on yourself. You got to focus on getting yourself ready, right? So if your opponent falls, or the person who's competing now, it doesn't make a difference. And a lot of times when we're cheering our teammates on, you want to be a good teammate now. Be a good teammate. Do cheer your teammates on, but you can't get emotionally attached to what's going on during the competition if you have a job to do. Okay, so I hope no one's misunderstanding me there. I want you to be a good teammate. I want you to be supportive. I want you to be positive. But you got to get yourself mentally, emotionally, and physically ready. And the way to do that is to make sure you're doing sports-related drills and skills right before you're about to go out there and compete, so you're not cold. You got to be ready, physically, mentally, and emotionally. So those are just some basic things. Another good mindset red flag that I could tell you is not having that killer instinct. Not competing with the killer instinct, not pulling the trigger on your techniques, on your skills in a competition. And we see that a lot. I've heard a lot of parents and a lot of coaches saying, my athletes, they're just too friendly out there. They're just too nice, right? And it's not saying we don't want to be fair and square and by the rules. We do. We want to win fair, square, and by the rules. And same thing, if we're losing, it's the same thing. There's virtue that we want to, the way we represent ourselves, a way we play, a way we compete, right? A way we win, a way we lose. But you can't be too nice out there in the sense of you're thinking too much about your opponent's feelings, right? You can't think about that kind of stuff. When you're out there, you got to be thinking more, it's kill or be killed. Now, I don't mean, there are, a lot of athletes too, some athletes compete a lot better when they're just looking at it as just a friendly competition, right? That's fine as long as you don't feel bad for your opponent when you're beating them, right? Because a lot of times we start being too nice. We start, we kind of take a back seat to them. We let them do to us. And we never, we're afraid to die for that loose ball. We're afraid to impose our will sometimes. And you have to be able to compete with that killer instinct and pull the trigger, right? You got to be diving for a loose ball. You got to be getting after it. If there's an opportunity, boom, you got to explode. So what if something bad happens? You got to get after it, because most athletes, they don't compete with that killer instinct. And that's a whole series that we have on building aggressiveness. We have a great do-it-yourself program. It's a do-it-yourself bundle. It's videos, it's mindset worksheets and exercises, all dedicated to building the killer instinct and developing a competitive alter ego. So that's something that you definitely want to make sure you're getting involved in and you're doing. Because a lot of athletes, my kid's too nice. He's too friendly out there. He just doesn't get mad. Now, it's not saying you have to be mad, but you do have to be competing with fire. Every athlete has to have fire when they're out there competing. That might look different for each person, but they all have to have that fire. So if your athlete's not competing with that killer instinct and they're not pulling the trigger on their techniques, that's a mindset red flag. So again, as you see, these are commonalities, and if you listen to them and you think about them, we all fall for almost all of them. We get sucked into these kind of things just because we're human. It's because that's the way we were trained. A lot of times we're trained to think like a fan or a spectator, okay? This making me think of another mindset red flag. And it's this one of the biggest ones, if not the biggest, that's giving good opponents too much respect. So when we know our opponent, or the team that we're going against, the individual we're going against, is ranked, or they beat us last year, they beat a team that beat us, right? We play all those mental gymnastics. We beat this team by this score, and they beat that team, or I beat this person by this score, and this person lost to them, and we play those mental gymnastics. We get in our own heads, right? We give our opponents too much respect. Oh, because this person or this team won this, or they're ranked, or they're seeded, right? We get caught up in seedings, records, rankings, predictions. It gets in our head, right? We wind up giving that opponent too much respect when maybe we could have beat that person. Again, working with tens and thousands of teams and individuals, we've seen, especially at the middle school and high school level, when do athletes usually compete at their very best? And almost all of them say, especially middle school and high school, when the opponent or the team is from another state. What do you think's going on there? They usually compete at their best when they're going up against an opponent that's in a different state. It's because they don't know who they are and they don't care who they are. And that's exactly what's going to bring out your best. If you don't know who your opponent is, you don't care who your opponent is, that's going to bring out your best. Now, I know at a local level, you're going to know who they are. You're just going to kind of know what they won because people are going to talk. You're going to hear things. But you don't want to feed that. In other words, you don't want to be feeding into all that and putting all that garbage in your head. You don't want to look at records. You don't want to look at rankings, seedings, predictions. You got to get off the forum, social media. You got to not focus on that as much too. LeBron James talks about it. During the playoffs, he goes on a social media blackout, and I think his phone too. Only certain people know his number, and there are people who know not to talk to him about sports. But he's off of social media and off of his phone during the playoffs because he doesn't want extra factors to get in his head. So that's an important thing. And if that's what one of the best athletes in the world is doing, we should really consider that for ourselves. So don't get sucked into the records, the rankings, the stories, social media. You got to be real careful, even Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, because you start to see what other people are saying about you. And their opinions and rankings and what they're seated and where you are in the bracket, right? We all like to look at the brackets. You got to stay away from all that because we think if I win, I go here. If I lose, I go down there. If we win and that team wins, we're going to go against each other. But if this team loses, it's just all extra garbage. And we always say you got to focus on the three things that are in your control: your effort, your attitude, and your aggressiveness. Now, of course, your preparation is in your control too, but preparation is more before the competition. During the competition, you're focused on effort, attitude, and aggressiveness. Of course, before, there's preparation, there's lifestyle, all those kind of things. Okay, so we got to make sure that we take the bull by the horns and we work on these mindset red flags. Because what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. If you're the type of person that always looks and says, oh, I know my opponents, they're seniors, or this is an older team, or this is an older athlete, and that makes us do worse, you're going to keep doing that over and over. Or, oh, I know I'm going up against a team that's ranked, or a team that beat me, or this wrestler beat me back when I was in 5th grade. I used to think that stuff. Even in high school, I would think, I lost to this kid in 5th grade. You're two totally different athletes when you're 16 years old versus when you were 8 or 9, but it would still be in our heads, right? So you got to decide, are you an athlete or are you a spectator? Okay, you're either a participant or you're a spectator. There's no in between, right? Players play, coaches coach, officials officiate, and fans, they stay in the stands, right? Oh, that's good, that rhymed. Well, we got to know our role. One last story. National duels, University of Pennsylvania, my brother's team, they were at the national duels, and it was at Arizona State, and the top 2 teams in the country, Iowa and Oklahoma State, were competing that round. Our team had a bye. Well, the team naturally wanted to watch the 1 and 2 teams compete, right? Because it would be fun. It would be nice to see the top 2 teams. Well, our coach, again, Zeke Jones, Olympic coach, who's a world champion in his own right. He was an Olympic silver medalist. And he said, men, we're not spectators here. We're competitors. We're not going to watch this competition. We're going in the back room to recover. So he kept us away from all the garbage. And I know a lot of top Olympic coaches, one of the things they try to do is they're careful with, they shield their athletes from having too much media around them. And especially now, it's got to be even crazier than back in like the 70s, 80s. But you don't want to get too engrossed in the media, right? Okay, some of you might have to in certain sports, in certain situations, you might have to do more interviews, but you don't want to then go looking for it. If they find you, that's fine, but you don't want to go looking for it. You don't want to make it into a bigger deal. Otherwise, we're more likely to do worse. So again, all these mindset red flags, if we keep doing what we're doing, we're going to keep getting what we're getting. So we've got to take the bull by the horns, and we've got to make sure we're working on our mindset on a regular basis. And this takes time, okay? So when it comes to being cautious, tentative, holding back, right, competing too conservative, that's something that's been built over time. If we're a slow starter, we don't get rolling until later on in the competition. That's been built up over time. If we're used to giving good opponents too much respect, it's been built up over time. Bad body language, that happens over time. So in order to counteract that, it's going to take some time. It's not just a poof and it's all gone. It's just like when you pick up bad habits technically, it takes time to correct those bad habits. if you're weak in a certain muscle group, it takes time to build up that muscle. Well, it's the same thing with mindset training. Why would it be any different? Right? Look at it like your technique. Look at it as your strength training. If you picked up all these bad mental habits over time, it will take time to unlearn that. But the good news is anything can be learned. If you've learned it, you could unlearn it. And if you've unlearned it, you could learn it. Okay, so if you don't, there are some athletes that naturally have certain, and I'm careful to say this because all athletes can work on their mindset at some level. We break down mindset into 8 different mental muscles, and all athletes are struggling or relatively weak in certain areas. So every athlete can benefit from mindset training, but it takes time. It's a process, just like your strength training, just like your technique. It doesn't happen overnight, but if you put the time in and if you work hard, just like your strength, you'll get stronger. Just like your technique and your skills, you'll become more technical. If you work on your mindset as an athlete or as a team, they're going to get better. They're going to change their perspective. They're going to compete with the killer instinct. They're going to start pulling the trigger. They're going to be fast starters. They're going to be competing aggressively, and they're going to have great body language. But it takes time. If you're willing to do it, we could help you get there. Winning Mindset, make sure you stay with us. We'll see you next week. Mindset Monday.